Now moving on to our keynote speaker today, and what a full-on morning. No one will need coffee at morning tea. Professor Dylan William. Dylan is an Emeritus Professor of Educational Assessment at the UCL Institute of Education. Throughout his distinguished career, Dylan has taught in urban public schools, directed a large-scale testing program, and held various administrative roles, including, wait for it, Dean of School of Education at King's College London. For the past 15 years, his academic work has focused on the use of assessment to support learning, sometimes called formative assessment. He now works with groups of teachers all over the world on developing formative assessment practices. Now, Dylan will be leading 2 masterclasses today, as well as a full-day workshop tomorrow, as well as participating in our panel discussion. We're very fortunate for him to join us, and so to generously share his wisdom, please give him a round of applause and welcome Professor Dylan William.
Thank you. And I'd just like to point out that my last name only has 1 L. The previous slide had 2 L's. Why has it only got 1 L? Well, how many L's do you need? But the real reason is that I'm Welsh. My mother tongue is Welsh. I didn't learn to speak English until I was 10. And in Welsh, double L is actually a different letter of the alphabet. It's a voiceless lateral alveolar fricative. And so if you wanted to sound like William in Welsh, you must only put 1 L. It causes huge amounts of problems, but that's where we are. Okay, so I want to talk to you today about 3 things. I want to talk to you about the fact that teachers are already working as hard as they can, and therefore, if you want to change things, you have to take things off teachers' plates. And people aren't doing that. They're just adding and adding, as the minister said. We have to get a bit smarter about that. And it's not just enough to say we've got to take things off teachers' plates. It's much harder than people think. I then want to talk a little bit about the role of research, because I think that's important. There are some people who say that research only tells teachers what they already knew, and there are other people who think that research is going to tell teachers what to do. Neither of those extreme positions is correct. Research can help, but research will never tell teachers what to do because classrooms are just too complex. So I just want to suggest how we might use research more productively. But the bulk of the time, I'm going to try to indicate 4 key shifts that we need to make in our teaching, in our education systems, if we are going to really live this idea of everyone counts, the idea that we have inclusive education for all. And I hope that these are practical enough for you to think about in your own contexts. So the starting point for teacher workload is this Italian economist, Vilfredo Pareto. He's widely known as the inventor of the 80-20 rule. He noticed that 80% of Italy's wealth was owned by 20% of the population. And many companies find that 80% of their profits come from 20% of their products. Many guidance counselors tell me that 80% of their problems come from 20% of their students. So this 80-20 rule has taken hold, but his most important work was in the design of taxation systems. He said you shouldn't raise new money in taxation until you're sure you're spending the money that you've got in the best way possible. And so a Pareto improvement is a change that can make at least one person better off without making anybody else worse off. When people talk about educational disadvantage, they talk about extending the school day. Now, there's 2 ways of extending the school day. One is to pay the teachers more money for the extra work, and the other is not to pay the teachers for the extra work. So, if you actually pay the teachers more, then the students are presumably better off, the teachers are better off, but now the taxpayer is worse off because education costs more. If you don't pay the teachers more, then the taxpayers are the same, the students are better off because they're getting more time, but now teachers are worse off because they're spending more time working for the same amount of money. And he was saying, don't do that until you're sure you've maximized all the opportunities for improving outcomes without increasing cost. So allocation of resources, such as teacher time, is Pareto optimal if there is no other way of getting better results than by spending more money. And I think money is really important. I think the previous discussion raised that very clearly. Here's the problem with money in education. There's never enough money, and there's always enough money. There's never enough money. We could always use more, but the money we've got is actually okay. The crucial thing is, are we using it in the best way possible? So we need to find ways of giving teachers the opportunity to change what they're doing so they're getting better results without putting in more effort. That would be a Pareto improvement, okay? The trouble is, it's really, really hard. By the way, you'll get all these slides available to you at the end of the presentation, and they're available to you under a Creative Commons license. So, and I'll give them to you in PowerPoint format. I've never understood presenters who give you just the PDFs. Because if they've got the PDFs, they can make up their own PowerPoints. You just annoyed them. So you can have them as PowerPoint files, and you can use them for whatever purpose you find most useful in your own places of work. Okay, we are cognitively primed for addition. We can't unlearn stuff. We can't unthink stuff. We can't just delete things from our hard disks. What works in one place might not work somewhere else. Your system might constrain what you can do. Making room for impact increases work in the short term, and then workload creeps back up. Parkinson's law is that work expands to fill the time available. That's why a motto that I've learned is that if you want to get something done, give it to a busy person, because they're much more likely to get it done. There are no oven-ready processes and lots of guilt. I want to be clear about this. Teaching is a very unusual job because it's an infinite job. Doctors get to say, we did all we could. No teacher gets to say that, because you know you can do more. You can always give another 20 minutes to another student to help them with their difficulties. And so the challenge with education is we all feel guilty if we don't put in that extra piece of work, even though we are contributing to our own burnout. So I think we have to acknowledge that teaching is this infinite job, and we need to help teachers basically survive. And that's why we need an explicit process. So 20 years ago, when I started talking about formative assessment, I said to head teachers, to principals, you need to take things off teachers' plates. And they said, yes, we agree. They just couldn't do it. I said, well, so what are you going to take off the teachers' plates? Well, we can't stop doing that, and we can't stop doing that, and we can't stop doing anything. And I realized the reason they were struggling was because they were looking for bad things to stop doing. And in education, just about everything teachers do helps students. So the irony is, in education, the essence of effective leadership is stopping teachers doing good things to give them time to do even better things. That's why it's so hard. I often say to teachers, I think you're spending too much time marking. And they say, are you saying marking is no good? No, marking is good. But just think that that hour you just spent marking those books could have been spent in a different way that would result in even more student progress. And that's the secret of making room for impact. It is finding these things we can do, that we currently do, that are good, but that time could be better spent on something else. A good example is teachers producing their own learning materials for their students. Many teachers believe that only they can meet their students' unique needs. Now, the evidence isn't strong on that point, but let's grant that's true. Let's say that the resources that the teacher produces are better than anything they could get online or from a textbook. That's the wrong question. The right question is the extra time that you spend producing those resources worth it in terms of the increased quality? Because it could be that this textbook isn't great, but it frees up a lot of time for you to then spend with individual students. So the crucial thing is helping teachers stop doing good things to give them time to do even better things. And that's why Aaron Hamilton, John Hattie, and I wrote a book called Making Room for Impact. And the reason we wrote a book is because it doesn't work without going through an explicit discovery process. Turns out that this is different in every school, because the spaces for improvement in one school are different from other schools. There are basically 4 processes. You can remove stuff. You can just say, we're not going to do these things. You can reduce the amount of time. You can re-engineer them, or you can replace. And the process we have developed, we call it the Room for Impact methodology, involves these 4 phases. So first, we select areas for de-implementation. It might be classroom display. Displaying students' work is great, but how much does it improve student learning? And in particular, where does the display go? Turns out the displays on the side and the front of the wall can be distracting for some students. Then you agree the focus area, you develop the de-implementation strategy and action plan, and then you begin the de-implementation. You then start that process. You then iterate, scale, or stop. This might be a process that runs several cycles in a school. It might be that after a few iterations, you realize that you've actually optimized what the school is doing. There is no way to make things better without spending more money, getting more teacher time, and then we appraise. And this cycle, we think, is the best advice we can offer schools for making room for impact. So that's the basic idea. Before you try to change anything, create some spare teacher time. Basically, for several reasons. 1, because they're already working as hard as they can. 2, to get teachers their lives back, because many teachers just burned themselves out helping their students through COVID by doing extra work. And the third thing is resilience in the system. So I think if the system is constantly hyper-optimized, then basically, whenever the next thing comes along, whatever it is, there won't be any slack in the system. So we actually have to look for ways of freeing up teacher time for teachers to think about improvement. And if I was going to ask the question about that the Archbishop and the Minister were asked, the thing that I would actually change about the education system is that every teacher, to keep their job, has to keep on getting better. Not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better. And giving time for teachers to reflect on their practice and improve, that to me is the key thing. But anyway, let's go look at the role of research. The first thing to say is everybody now wants evidence-based research. First, it's a continuum, not a category. There are things that are more or less research-based. And as I said, research will never tell teachers what to do. What it can do is tell you where things are likely to help. That's quite important. It tells you whether it's going to work under all conditions. So a classic example is class size reduction. Now, my friend John Hattie says that class size reduction doesn't work. He is wrong about that. If you taught a smaller class, you would get better results. Here's the problem with class size reduction. You need more teachers. And that's the lesson that California discovered in the late 1990s. They reduced class size from 30 down to 20, discovered they needed an extra 200,000 teachers, couldn't train them quickly enough, so they gave emergency permits to 200,000 teachers just to put sentient bodies in classrooms. And so they performed a rather wonderful trick. They increased the cost of education by 50% and made things worse at the same time. So basically, don't reduce class size unless the teachers you're adding are as good as the ones you've already got. It gives you an indication of how much improvement is possible or likely. I don't think you can make a decision about change unless you understand how much improvement in the student learning you're going to get, and then also the cost. But I don't mean in money, I mean in teacher time. Because teacher time is the most precious resource in any education system. Because every hour that a teacher spends on one thing is an hour they don't have to spend on something else. And so people say, well, what works? That's a wrong question. How much does it work, and how much time will it take? And so, for example, it's very common in most rich countries to lament the subject knowledge of primary school teachers. They don't know enough mathematics. We have to improve the system by improving their knowledge of mathematics. Now, with better knowledge of mathematics, those teachers will be better, but not much. The best research we've got suggests that one standard deviation of mathematical knowledge for teaching, taking a teacher who is average up to the top 1/6, improves the rate of student progress by about 5 to 10% per year. There's better things to do with the time. And so my challenge for every principal is, let's say you can carve out 25 hours of professional development for each teacher each year in your school. what use of that 25 hours is going to have the biggest benefit for your students? We'd all wish for more knowledgeable, more creative, more engaging teachers. But as Linda Darling-Hammond says, you can't fire your way to Finland. You can't basically improve your education system by sacking the bad teachers, because there aren't enough of them, and it's too hard to do. And anyway, how do you know who the bad teachers are? I'm going to be talking about that in my breakouts. So I'm going to argue that we need to make 4 key shifts. I think these are practical, I think these are achievable, but they're politically difficult. So how far you can go in your own institution will depend on whether you have an alternative source of income and you can afford to get sacked. No, seriously, it's going to be difficult, and it depends on the governance structures that you're working in. So I want to talk about how we think about learning. I want to talk about how we think about aptitude, because this is quite a controversial idea. I want to talk about how we think about curriculum, and in particular, how we sequence things. And finally, how we think about instruction. And now, I ought to use some care in defining the word instruction, because to an Australian audience, the word instruction sounds a bit like telling or lecturing. In psychology, the term instruction is all the things that educators do to get students to learn things. So, when I started teaching in the 1970s, there was such an acute shortage of maths and science teachers, you didn't need a qualification as a teacher. Just a maths degree or a science degree and a pulse was enough. So I started teaching in Shepherd's Bush in West London in the 1970s. And because I hadn't been trained, I had to be inspected by the divisional inspector. So I was told that on Wednesday afternoon, the divisional inspector is going to watch you teach. And so I prepared this wonderful lesson where I had these students discussing whether a square was a trapezium. So they're having these great discussions. I was going from table to table, checking that all these students were on task. The divisional inspector pops his head round the door and says, "Oh, I'll come back when you're teaching." So his view of teaching was me standing at the front declaiming. Okay, that's quite an old-fashioned view. But most people's definition of teaching does not include setting good homework, and it definitely does not include liaising with parents about how to support their own children in their learning. So the word instruction is an all-encompassing term that includes all the things we do to get students to learn stuff. And I think that's quite an important generalization beyond this idea of what the teacher is doing towards creating the context for learning. Okay, so let's start with a shift of how we think about learning. So learning is a relatively permanent change in what people can do. What psychologists call performance is temporary fluctuations produced during the acquisition process. Why is this distinction so important? Well, I think the minister referred to it already with those students coming to Parliament House. We've all had the experience of teaching this wonderful lesson, and you check for understanding at the end, and every student's got it. You feel really pleased, and then 3 weeks later, you check again, and it's as if the men in black have come along with their neuralizers and erased every trace of that lesson from the students' minds. And they'll say, "You didn't teach us this." "Yes, I did. I've got it on video." But the fact is, we produced an increase in performance. We didn't produce an increase in learning. And we're very careless about the way we use this term learning. So recently, I needed to fix a leaking tap in my house in Florida. American taps are different from British taps. I watched a YouTube video, and I told my wife I learned how to fix the tap by watching a YouTube video. But that's not quite correct, because if I needed to do it again, I would need to watch the video again. I didn't learn it. I followed a set of instructions to get the desired result. And this idea of distinguishing between learning, which is relatively permanent, and performance is crucial. And it's crucial in terms of teacher evaluation. Because in England, the school inspectors wanted to see learning in a lesson, progress in learning in a lesson, which shows they know nothing about psychology. Because learning is that gradual strengthening of connections in the mind that takes place over a period of weeks. There's no such thing as learning in a lesson. There are experiences that may or may not get laid down as long-term memories. And so, learning and performance are different. The early research on rats running mazes showed you could have increase in learning with no increase in performance until there was a reward. But here's the more important thing. We've now seen that you can have increases in performance that can fail to yield long-term benefits. And in fact, and this is the crucial thing, sometimes making things hard on yourself but in a good way leads to better learning. This is the origin of this term desirable difficulties you may have heard from Robert Bjork. Making students think about something as they're learning it seems to result in longer lasting learning than just telling them about it. And so sometimes making things hard on yourself is powerful. Let me give you an example. This is a nice study from the Air Force Academy in America. And they research a lot of things. I mean, the American military is one of the greatest research organizations in the world because it matters. Because if they don't get things right, people die, soldiers die. So they're really keen about learning and researching this. So they took 10,000 students who attended the Air Force Academy over a period of 8 years, and by chance, they were randomly allocated. Some got less experienced, some got more experienced, more qualified instructors. What they were surprised to see was that those who were given the less qualified, less experienced instructors got higher end of course scores. Maybe these young instructors are more up to date with the latest research. Maybe they're more enthusiastic. Nope. Because when they looked at follow-on courses, those students did worse. Why? Because the less experienced instructors were preparing the students for this year's test. The more experienced instructors were preparing students for next year's test. The fact is that good teachers prepare for lifelong learning rather than maximizing scores on this year's test. And here's what's really interesting. The students who are actually getting less good education thought they were being better taught. They give higher ratings. Students do not know when they're learning. None of us do. None of us know when we're learning. I've lost track of the number of times I've put something in my freezer and I haven't bothered to label it because I know I'm going to remember what it is. And 6 weeks later, I take out this frozen mass and I have no idea what it is. The fact that I forgot is not interesting. What is interesting is how certain I was that I would remember what it was. How certain I was that I would remember where I've parked my car in the airport car park. Which is why I now realize, no matter how certain you feel, take a photo. We don't know whether what we're learning, what we're experiencing is going to stick. So the fact is, we need to be quite cautious about these claims, which we'll go on to later on. So we need to shift from a focus on performance to a focus on learning. Am I teaching this in a way that makes it likely to stick? My job is not to get through the curriculum. My job is to help my students understand this. A shift in how we think about aptitude. Now, aptitude is quite an old-fashioned word. Some people call it ability. Some people call it natural talent. And there's a kind of fashionable doctrine these days that every kid, there's no such thing as talent anymore. There's no such thing as natural talent in mathematics, for example. And I think that's problematic. So here's an interesting chart. This is from the Lieberhume Numerous Research Program. What proportion of students can answer that question given to them orally, verbally, but then they're allowed paper to work it out, okay? So what proportion of kids can add age 60 to 570? At age 6.5, it's about 20%. By the time they're 11, most students can do it. So over 5 years, the increase is 75%, an average of 15% per year. In other words, every year, about 4 or 5 children in the average primary school classroom get this. I can guarantee this is being taught every year. But learning is slow. Some students get it at the age of 7. Some students still haven't got it at the age of 11. It's really challenging. This shows how does the achievement of 4-year-olds compare to 5-year-olds, compare to 6-year-olds, and so on. So this is a model where I made different assumptions about how spread out the cohort is. And most people think that things are probably a bit like that. There's some overlap between year 7 and year 8, for example. But in general, kids are making progress. It turns out, if you look at Australian data, it's probably more like that. And you kind of know that. You kind of know that in a class of 11-year-olds, you've got some students who would struggle to match the average 6-year-old, and some students who can outperform the average 16-year-old. The range of achievement is huge. That's why it's so hard, because students differ in their aptitude. Now, this is uncomfortable. So let me just see where you are on this. Is an IQ test score at the age of 11 a good predictor of ATAR rank at the age of 18? So I've asked this question in a typical bad teacher way, so some people are going, and some people go like this, but they're basically trying to move enough to get credit for being right if it turns out they were right. But they can just pretend they were stretching if it turns out they were wrong. So I'm going to do it in the formative assessment way. I'm going to ask you to vote with thumbs up or thumbs down. And can I point out, I can tell if you haven't voted. It's pretty obvious. Is an IQ score at the age of 11 a good predictor of ATAR rank? Yes or no? Those of you with thumbs up are correct. The rest of you are wrong. I hate that fact. I hate the fact that some children, even though they've done nothing to deserve it, get given brains that soak up school stuff. They find learning so easy. They remember everything we've done in the classroom. And other children don't get those brains. I think it's really unfair. In the same way that I think it's really unfair that taller people are better at basketball. Which is particularly unfair for me as quite a short person, really. And those tall people, they didn't deserve to be tall. They just were given genes that made them grow. And this is quite difficult to talk about, but there's now increasing agreement that school achievement is substantially genetic. I used to believe that the behavior of middle-class parents was one of the reasons that middle-class kids did so well in school. But now I have to say I don't know that anymore because I haven't controlled for the genetic component. It could be just genetics. I don't know that that's true. I'm just much less certain than I used to be. There's no doubt there's a genetic component to scholastic achievement. The question is, what are you going to do about that? And that's why this issue of aptitude is so important. So from a proportion of complexity of taught material retained to the time taken to relearn the material. This goes back to the work of John Carroll. See, our traditional model is some kids get it, some kids don't. And we say that's okay. There's that range of achievement. We say that's okay. No, it's not. Now, some students need more support to reach that. But the question is, are we going to give that support? And if we really believe that everyone counts, then we have to make sure that the students who need more support to thrive and flourish in school are going to get that support. That's the crucial thing about making sure that every child flourishes. A shift in how we think about curriculum. And this is really quite an important issue that Benjamin Bloom raised many years ago. He pointed out that if you're getting a bell curve of results, a normal distribution, you're not doing your job properly. Because the bell curve, the normal distribution, is what nature gives us. If students differ in how easy they find learning, if you teach all students the same, you will get a normal distribution. The normal distribution is a sign of educational failure. Our job as teachers is to destroy the bell curve, to make sure that those students who need more support to thrive and flourish get that extra support. And so that's why I think we need to make sure that our system isn't a kind of one shot, one chance to learn something. That's where the idea of formative assessment comes from. We teach, we assess, and we find out where the students are. And then we make adjustments. So this is really important, and it goes back to the work of David Ausubel, who now, over 50 years ago, said, if I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. Start from where the students are. Obvious, isn't it? But we don't do it. We say really foolish things to our children like, you should know this, you're in year 7. Well, in Australia, how do you get into year 7? Start in year 6 and have a birthday. That's basically it. Have you had a birthday? On you go. Reminds me of the joke of a man driving in a flat part of England known as the Fens. It really is flat. Like Gedney Hill is 3 meters above sea level because Gedney is 2 meters above sea level. Okay, it's really flat. A guy driving in the countryside realizes he's lost, stops the car, winds down the window and asks the local, how do I get to Cambridge? And the local says, well, if I was you, I wouldn't start from here. And that's a joke because it's a foolish thing to say, but that's what we say to our students. You should know this, you're in year 7. But they don't. So we need to find out where they are, and that's why the uncomfortable fact about the world, we need assessment, because our students do not learn what we teach. You take in the books, you teach this wonderful lesson, you take in the work, and you wonder what planet your students were on when you were teaching. How could you possibly believe that's what I said? Our daily experience as teachers is failure. I'm going to fail here today. Many of you are going to walk out those doors in about a quarter of an hour, absolutely convinced I said things I know I did not say. Teachers fail all the time, but teachers are the most ridiculously optimistic people on the planet. You've taught this lesson so far 15 times in your career, and never have more than half the students got it, but this time is going to be different. This time you're going to nail it. This time every child is going to get when it's has an apostrophe. We fail all the time because we want every child to succeed. I don't know of a single teacher who goes in and saying, well, I'm going to give it a go, but I know that only about half the class are going to get it. No, you really want every child to succeed. And so basically we accept that failure and say, what else can I try? So, as I said, learning, I think, is best defined as a change in long-term memory. People dislike that definition. They say, oh, it's more than memorization. Yes, it is. Because in psychology, long-term memory is where you store everything you don't need to relearn how to do. So if you can ride a bicycle, it's in long-term memory. And what Paul Kirshner and his colleagues are pointing out here is that if we teach students something that they can do today, but they can't do in 3 weeks' time, we should not call that learning. Our goal should be teaching for things that stick. This is really hard because the fact that students can do something now does not mean they can do it in 6 weeks' time. But, and this is the foundational idea, if they can't do it at the end of today's lesson, it's highly unlikely they'll be able to do it in 6 weeks' time. We will make better decisions about what to do next if we have better evidence about what's going on in our students' heads. Better evidence, better decisions, better learning. It's as simple as that. And by better, I mean better in 2 ways. First is deeper, asking questions that are worth asking. So don't ask students, would your weight be the same on the moon? They're going to get that right. Ask them, would their mass be the same on the moon? Because most students get that wrong because they haven't understood the critical distinction between mass and weight. In primary school maths, which is bigger, 0.25 or 0.3? Why is that worth asking? Because many children use the decimal point ignored strategy. They think that 0.25 is bigger than 0.3 because 25 is bigger than 3. So it's questions that are worth asking and then getting information from the whole class rather than just the usual suspects. I was talking to a teacher at Brisbane Grammar School last year, and she was talking about this lesson she taught about statistics, and she was talking about the importance of a representative sample in a statistical sampling. And she asked this question to the class, and the smartest girl in the room answers the question correctly, and she said, good. And she suddenly realized the irony of what she had just done. She had this kind of road to Damascus experience. I'm talking about the importance of having a representative sample, and I've just depended on the least representative sample I could get about the class's understanding. So it's about getting a response from every single student, not just the usual suspects. You can do this with cold call, what Douglas Wolff calls cold call, picking on students who haven't raised their hand, and people say, oh, you can't do that because it's scary, it makes them anxious. Well, actually, the evidence is it doesn't, but here's a really important point. It needs to be framed appropriately. I'm picking on you not because it's a gotcha where I think you weren't paying attention. I'm picking on you because I need to hear from you. You belong in this learning community, and I can't make an appropriate decision without hearing from you about what's going on in your head. And if we frame this idea more broadly like that, then I think we'll make better decisions. The big idea here, we build plan B into plan A. We keep on checking on the understanding our students are evolving to see if we're on the right track. There's a real paradox here. Every teacher I've ever met knows that no lesson plan survives the first contact with children. But what's odd is most teachers plan their lessons as if they're going to go perfectly. So let's build our lesson plans with checkpoints. So you can do this on a long cycle, a medium cycle, or a short cycle. So the long cycle is across terms of teaching units, and this is what Gonski's report said should happen in Australia. We need formative assessment. It's kind of okay. You know, it's really bad if you get to the end of year 5 and a lot of kids aren't ready for year 6. But it's not what I'm talking about formative assessment. It's not even the medium cycle stuff. It's the minute by minute and day by day stuff. The formative assessment should be happening every 6 to 10 minutes, not every 6 to 10 weeks. Because then you get better information about what to do next. Here's a class of year 1 students. The teacher's written something on the board, and she just asked them, is this correctly punctuated? And there's one boy at the front left there more interested in me than everything else. I could not get him to turn around. Most of the children think there's a mistake there. A couple of boys on the bottom right think it's okay. But the teacher is getting a constant stream of information so she can decide what to do next on the basis of the evolving understanding of the class. It's a pedagogy of engagement and a pedagogy of responsiveness. And that's what makes inclusive education. Everybody counts. Everybody matters in this classroom. Doesn't mean I'm going to slow down the lesson for the slower student. I might decide to say, I'm going to talk to you about this later on. But the idea is you can't make good decisions without good evidence. Better evidence, better decisions, better learning. High school example. Teacher wrote up an unbalanced chemical equation, asked students to contribute quantities of the compounds, and when nobody wanted to change anything, she said, is that now correct? And every student had to vote yes or no. Do you see how different that is from the usual, everyone okay with that? Because now there's no place to hide. If you vote yes, when it's not right, you just prove to the teacher you don't know what you're talking about. But if you vote no, you know what's going to happen, don't you? The teacher's going to ask you to come out to the front and fix the mistake. The idea is that we have a pedagogy of engagement, so we're getting information from everybody in the class, and a pedagogy of responsiveness, we're responding to students in real time to meet their learning needs. So a shift in how we think about teaching from a linear process to a contingent process. I flew from Los Angeles to Brisbane yesterday. I am really glad that our pilot had never been a high school teacher. Because I'm sure if he'd been a high school teacher, he'd have planned the journey from LAX to Brisbane like this. He'd have planned the flying time as 13 and a half hours on a bearing of 230 degrees. He'd fly for about 13 hours and then look for an airport, set down the nearest one and say, is this Brisbane? And they say, no, it's Sydney. But the pilot says, I'm sorry, but you've got to get off the plane. I've got another job to go to. Because that's what we do in high school. We teach chapter 6, and at the end of chapter 6, we give them a test. And if they've done well, we say good. And if they've done badly, we say too bad. We're going on to chapter 7 tomorrow. So all I'm suggesting is that we, as teachers, should do what our pilot did, which is certainly to plan a route, but then make regular checks on progress along the way, and if necessary, change course as conditions dictate. Teaching should be a contingent process. We can't really decide what to do until we've got evidence from our students about what's going on in their heads. And then finally, about instruction. So this builds very heavily on the work of John Sweller, the Australian psychologist. And he points out that there are 5 things about our brains that really need to be understood to design really effective teaching. So the first thing is that natural information processing systems need a huge store of information. So let me give you an example. I don't know if you've seen the TV show Countdown. In one of the segments, you have to make a target number by using the numbers below. So can you, using the 4 rules of arithmetic, make 127 using those numbers? And even if you haven't got it yet, I bet the fact that for most of you, 25 times 4 was 100 just leapt into your consciousness. It was there. You didn't need to go looking for it. What you saw triggered the recall of that fact from memory. And what we're now learning is that when students show any degree of expertise, it's dependent on what's in long-term memory. Just seeing that 25 and the 4, and my number's 127, and you also know that 3 nines is 27, you're there. So the important point is, we've often mistaken the role of education. We want to give students thinking skills. So we give them practice in thinking, and that's the wrong focus. We need to give them more things to think with. Progress in learning involves having a richer repertoire of strategies, of concepts, of what psychology calls schemas that we can draw upon. And that's why long-term memory is at the heart of education. The main purpose of curriculum is to improve long-term memory. It's the things that will never go away. So there's 2 processes we can use to build up this store of knowledge. One is the borrowing and reorganizing principle, and the other is the randomness as generis principle. And both of these are hardwired. This is how humans learn. Our brains are designed to do this. So this is from John Sweller. I'll just give you a chance to read that. I just want to draw attention to how I've presented this to you. Because one of the problems we have with some students is what's called the transient information effect. They forgot what the teacher just said. And so here I've been careful to build up the presentation, step by step, to focus your attention, but I'm also giving you access to what came before, so that if you need to, you can go back and look back. This is a really important part of teaching in Japanese cultures, for example. Teachers are graded on what's called bansho, board work. Because 80% of what a teacher writes on a board is still there at the end of the lesson. Why? Because the lesson is meant to build up. The 4th principle is the narrow limits of change principle. So each of us has a kind of bottleneck in our consciousness. Basically, our short-term memory is only about 6 or 7 things, maybe 4 if they're very complicated. And we can't, basically memory training doesn't work. You can't increase short-term memory. And the fact is that aptitude, I mentioned earlier, is mostly about short-term memory. So one of the reasons that some students find learning easier than others is they have better short-term memory. They have more of it. They can hold more in their heads. More of it sticks. Because you need spare short-term memory to create long-term memories. So one of the things that John Sweller has pointed out is that we often make things harder for students because we give them things like this. Doesn't look hard to you, probably because you studied this. But to a student with more limited working memory, the problem is they have to shift their attention from one side of the page to the other, and they get lost. And all you do is change it like that, so you integrate the text into the diagram. It reduces the load on short-term memory, and therefore, low working memory students are more successful. This is one of the most important things I want to stress today. The fact is that our teaching will be better if we teach in a way that assumes that our students are not like us. We in this room are high working memory people. It's how we were successful at school. And many of our students aren't the same as that. We need to teach in a way that doesn't place a huge advantage on those that have more working memory. It even works in Chinese. If you teach it in the horizontal format, many kids don't learn. And in fact, what's interesting is if you teach it in the vertical format, you make an average learner into one of the top 1/6. Because you're reducing the load on working memory. If we actually design our instruction so it depends on working memory, many of our students will not be successful. Science teaching, there's an interaction effect here. So the important thing is that the explicit followed by exploration, the solid line, was more successful for the weaker learners, less successful for the stronger learners. And so what we find is this expertise reversal effect. Step-by-step instructions can be helpful for the lower achievers, less helpful for the higher achievers. So I'm going to skip this. Here's the really important point. The environment triggers the recall of information from long-term memory into short-term memory. That's how you could recall that 25 times 4 is equal to 100. It just popped there because it was in your long-term memory. The way we make kids smarter is by giving them more things to think with. So actually, a shift in how we think about instruction from a process that works for some to a process that works for all. Wherever we can, designing our teaching in a way that does not place an unfair advantage on students who have done nothing to deserve their extra working memory, but have it just the same. If we do this, I think really quite profound improvements in our students' educational achievement are possible, because there are some things that are just natural, maybe even genetic, but we're making things worse for the students who are less advantaged because of the way we teach. And we can definitely do something about that by making our teaching contingent rather than linear, and by designing our instruction that doesn't require you to have a large working memory for it to work. Thank you.
I think we could do with another round of applause there.